Hello and welcome to the Green Growth Knowledge Platform webinar entitled Can International Trade Increase Resource Efficiency? My name is Benjamin Simmons and I serve as the head of the GGKP Secretariat. I would like to just provide a few words of introduction before we begin today's webinar. Founded by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Bank, the GGKP has expanded to a partnership of over 40 leading international organizations, universities, and think tanks. These common partners share a belief that mobilizing a green economy transition requires that policymakers, practitioners, and experts have access to cutting-edge knowledge and data to support their efforts. With this mandate in mind, the GGKP focuses on two main sets of activities. The first is to work with our partner institutions to identify and address major knowledge gaps in green growth theory and practice. And the second is to identify, gather, and share green growth knowledge and data with the growing community of practice. As part of these activities, over the course of 2015, the GGKP has hosted a Green Growth webinar series with thanks to the generous financial support from Germany's GIZ and the Swiss government. Today's webinar, the sixth and final webinar for the year, will focus on a recently released International Resource Panel report entitled International Trade and Resources, a Biophysical Assessment. Before introducing our moderator for today's event, I'd like to highlight a few logistical issues. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff, who will then report them to all the participants for our panelists to address during the question and answer period. We will also be circulating a survey after the webinar concludes, and I would encourage you to complete this as it provides us with important feedback to help shape our future webinars. Finally, if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please email us at contact@ggkp.org and we will help you to troubleshoot those challenges. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Professor Paul Eakins. Paul Eakins is a professor of resource and environmental policy and director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources and director of research at the School of Sustainable Resources and Energy at University College London, director of the UK Energy Research Centre. Professor Eakins also has the distinction of serving as both a panel member of the International Resources Panel and as an advisory committee member of the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, and therefore is particularly well placed to moderate today's event. Paul, it is now my great pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, and welcome to all the listeners from London. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time zone you happen to be in. This is going to be an exciting webinar because it's a great report produced, as Ben said, by the International Resource Panel under the leadership of our main speaker today, Marina Fischer-Kowalski. I made a small contribution to the report, so I know that we're in for a treat thanks to Marina and her expert friends who did the main work on it. After Marina has presented for 20 minutes, we'll then move to our two discussants. We have Dale Andrews, who's an independent consultant and former head of the Environment Division, Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD, so very well placed to comment on this report. And then we'll move over to Michel Gressot, who's the senior economist at Global Footprint Network, for his comments. They'll each give us about 10 minutes of comments. I shall then go back very briefly to Marina for any immediate reactions to those comments, but the real action of all these webinars comes from you, the listeners. Ben asked you to send in your questions. Please do that. The webinars that I participated in the past have been successful precisely because people were very participatory. They asked incredibly good questions, and that was a great challenge to our panelists after all the presentations to explain in more detail, to clarify, and indeed to have a very good discussion about the issues at stake. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Marina Fischer-Kowalski. She is the founder of the Institute of Social Ecology in Vienna. She's also a professor at the Alpen Adria University and senior lecturer at the University of Vienna. And as Benjamin said, she is a member of the International Resource Panel and led this report on international trade. Marina, very welcome. Very nice to see you online again. And over to you for your 20-minute introduction, please.
So, welcome. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. So, I don't hear you anymore. Paul, am I supposed to start speaking? Hello?
Yes, I was muted just briefly then, but I'm now back online, so you should be able to hear me. And you should indeed start speaking now and make your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So, can international trade increase resource efficiency? A grand question. The talk is about international trade not from a physical perspective, not from a financial perspective, and that may be unusual. And I'm not only talking about direct trade, those materials that are delivered all across the world, but also about the upstream requirements of trade. So, I start with my agenda. My question 1 is, how important is international trade in supplying countries with resources? And how does dependency on trade change over time? That's my first question. Second question, which roles do countries occupy in international trade? Where are the centers of demand? And where are the locations of international supply of resources? What factors determine this distribution? And the third question refers to the upstream requirements of trade. Does their consideration change anything in the picture? Well, and finally, I'll try to answer the lead question, can international trade improve global resource efficiency? I start with the dynamics of international trade, but I'm trying to shift the picture so that sorry. No, it doesn't work that way. I have to, because maybe you can help me. I have the, what am I? Okay, I go on. So, dynamics of international trade. International trade in physical terms grows faster than world GDP. It grows faster than population, of course, and it grows also faster than the extraction of resources. Here I show you how different trade in physical terms looks compared to trade in monetary terms. Let's see the 2010 picture. There you see that in physical terms, trade in raw materials or in resources at a very low degree of manufacture makes 80% of all trade, while in monetary terms, in financial terms, 70% are manufactures. So it's just the other way around. So if I talk about international trade in physical terms, I really talk about trade in raw materials, basically. So physical trade volumes by their composition. Dominating world trade is fossil fuels. You see this huge gray area here and rising area. They amount to about 50% of global trade, and fossil fuels or countries depend to 30% on international trade to get their fossil fuels. Metal ores and minerals, that is orange and blue part, are about 40% of international trade, and countries rely even more upon them. It's almost 3/4 of their supply comes from traded materials. And finally, biomass is something that's still a major share, but countries are largely self-sufficient in biomass. So even if it's a large share, it does not few countries depend on it. Okay, I'll give you a quick picture of trade in biomass. Who leads it? So you see upwards means you import, you have a net import, downwards bars mean a net export. So you see China leading in need for imports and the US in exporting. Similar thing for trade in metals. There is Australia is the big deliverer of metals to the world, followed by Brazil. And again, China is the one with the greatest demand. And all materials, largest 10 net exporters and 10 importers in 2010. Again, we have Australia dominated by this blue bar metals, that's the key thing, and China excelling. Here you get the same thing as a geographical picture of the world. And all brown countries are net exporting countries, and the green countries are net importing countries. And this is a share of their extraction or a share of their consumption. That's how Monika Dietrich analyzed this. I come back to this figure again. Just quickly for world regions, we see Asia is the region with the highest trade volumes. It imports high weight and low unit price raw materials and exports lower weight and higher unit price manufactures. That's really a big high curve up there. European countries follow next, also in imports and exports, but that has a lot to do with the fact that they are smaller countries and exchange among each other. And North America follows in imports. So what determines importing or exporting, net importing or exporting processes? Here we have the physical trade balance by income level. And there we see the red line on top, positive value, so they import more than they export. That's high income OECD countries. Interesting enough, high income non-OECD countries are below the line. That's the blue curve down there. And these are mainly countries that produce oil. So they are major exporters. So on average, income alone is not determining net importers of resources. Besides, the world of trade is changing. Low and middle income countries catch up in trade activity. What you see here is for the years 1990, 95 and 2010. And the steepest incline you see for low income to low income, or low and middle income to low and middle income countries. That's where the trade grew most. Everywhere it did grow, but that's the most pronounced change. And before, as you see, the low to medium income countries have little participation in international trade at all. Besides income, another thing matters, population density. So what you see here is above the zero line, so net importers are high population density countries, net exporters are low population density. So regions of low population density tend to be global exporters. One more of you saw this figure already about net exporters and net importers across the world. What you have on top of that is small green circles. These green circles show the countries that in recent past have changed from net exporters to net importers. So that's many countries that did that. While the red circles mark countries that have switched from importers to exporters. It's very few. That's just 3 countries. Yeah, and one last slide for my first question. If we analyze metal, you saw that metals play such a big role among resource trade. What we find in the background is declining ore grades across the world for metal mines. And that means that the weight of the traded ores relative to the metal content is rising. And of course, it is also a signal of scarcity. Yeah, that was my first and second question. Now I shift to the upstream requirements of trade. What I've been talking about now is physical trade, and that's accounted for by the weight at the boundary, at borders. And imports feed into consumption, and unless they are re-exported, they become wastes. And so the waste potential of countries is determined by these direct physical trades. While upstream requirements of trade are the amount of whatever background issue used to produce the commodities that are then actually traded. Part of them are already turned into wastes and emissions in the countries of origin of traded commodities and, well, contribute to environmental burden. First material or first resource I will talk about is water. There's a big analysis about virtual water balances and gross virtual water related to trade. And these data are getting ever better. And what you see, what you see is that North America, particularly the United States, are major virtual water deliverers to Asia and Japan and, well, mainly to Asia. While Europe and Northern Africa and also Mexico are receivers of virtual water. These flows have increased massively in the past. There's 1986 and 2007, and you see that there's a huge increase in virtual water delivery between regions. Savings through trade occur when the import of water embodied in traded products results in lower water use, for example, lower irrigation in the country of destination than in the country of origin. And these savings are a result of climate and fertility or production technologies. But what the researchers do is aggregating country-level savings to global savings. These global savings, if you will, free up water for more immediate needs and may help preserve groundwater reservoirs. Well, and according to most studies, global aggregate savings via trade amount to several hundred cubic kilometers of saving of water. So this is an important issue. Next, I talk about cropland. Again, cropland isn't traded directly, it's traded only as upstream flow. And the color in this figure shows the rates of self-sufficiency of countries. And the arrows show how much cropland is virtually transferred from one region to the other. And there you see, on the one hand, you see an increase of and a sort of, not always a reduction of self-sufficiency stays similar, but you see an increase of virtual cropland associated to trade. And this amounts to a large share of the areas of the world, of the cropland areas of the world that are embodied in trade. So it has been 44% here, and it's now almost 60%. So another issue, you may not consider that a resource, or not a natural resource, but certainly an economic and a social resource. There's also efforts to calculate the upstream employment footprint of trade. And what you see here is the dark bars means of all the domestic consumption the dark bar amount or share is delivered by domestic labor, while the light bar shows what the share is delivered by imports. And what you find here is that, well, Europe has the highest share of imported labor. It has about 50-50 domestic and imported labor, while in Asia Pacific, for example, or also in Africa, almost all domestic consumption is provided for by domestic labor. Okay, so, and now I show you materials that had also been subject of my question number 2, but here I discuss whether the upstream materials make a difference. And this is a very active research area with in part contradictory results, so I show you a few examples. This is an example that compares the US and Latin American countries. And what you can see for the US, trade balances, including upstream materials, are 80% higher than direct trade balance, the physical trade balances, which are also positive already, as we have seen before. For the Latin American countries, this is the other way around. All trade balances are negative. There are more exports than imports. And Chile is an example with an exceptionally high upstream flow because of its copper exports, and copper has a lot of burden leaving behind. So here you find this basic idea that often comes up in trade discussions, that developing countries deliver resources and rich countries consume them. Trade balances, here you have a systematic comparison of physical trade balances and these raw material inclusive raw material trade balances for Europe from 2000 to 2012. What you see is that the raw material inclusive trade balances are 40% more positive than the direct trade balances, and well, direct trade goes both go a little down, but this is not a real trend over such a short time, so I would not overinterpret this change. Okay, last empirical slide. Resource use of selected countries with and without upstream requirements. There we end up with the well-known material footprint, which is a little bit something different than the ecological footprint, because it doesn't include the carbon balance, it only includes the materials. And here we see some countries like Japan having an extremely much higher material footprint, that is, all the materials that are required for domestic consumption, and a relatively small DMC, direct domestic material consumption. Australia is the other way around, although it's a Western industrial country, but it is, as you had seen before, one of the main deliverers of raw materials to the world. And Mexico and Brazil and developing countries tend to have about a balanced situation between material footprint and domestic material consumption. So, let me try to conclude. Can trade increase resource efficiency? Well, of course, international trade plays a vital role in overcoming a mismatch between supply and demand for natural resources. In principle, the allocation of extraction, it allows the allocation of extraction activities in regions where resources are available in high quality and where extraction activity might be less resource intensive. As the example of virtual water shows, trade can really provide global resource savings. But trade serves well countries with high purchasing power to satisfy their consumption, And at the same time, it provides an opportunity for resource-rich countries to develop their infrastructures and labor force, often at high environmental costs. China is an example of this. So this is all positive, but upstream requirements of trade globally are rising. So this is no indication, it's not a proof against it, but it's no indication of improving resource efficiency. Second consideration, the solutions that trade provides are not infinite. Resource scarcity and the rising number of competitors increase pressures on the resource base and the environment and make access increasingly difficult for poorer countries with a small or depleted resource base. The ongoing restructuring of the world market serves the position of resource-rich countries, whatever income, and creates new conflict frontiers within countries and between countries, as the occurrences in the among the North African producers indicate. Well, a short glimpse on resource prices. They have been declining all the 20th century. Chatham or McKinsey predict that even if there is now a lump, they will keep on rising. I think they are right. So, a more sustainable global resource regime would require a drastic reduction of fossil fuel use and fossil fuel trade and its substitution by non-material energy sources, wind energy, solar energy, in line with climate protection, but also as a problem solver on the level of global trade. It appears inevitable that the world economy and high-income countries in particular turn down a more circular economy, away from short-lived wasteful production, recycling, and reusing the many resources that they accumulated in their stocks and waste deposits. So, through many decades of net importing, high-income countries have very well-filled waste deposits, well filled with metals and rare resources. Now, trading and using ever more virgin resources is in the long run not the solution. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Marina. Very interesting. The questions have started to come in, I'm pleased to say, and I shall be glad to be taking those once we've heard from our discussants. So we're going to move straight over now to our first discussant. As you can see on your screen, he's former head of Environment Division, Trade and Agriculture Directorate at OECD. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Dale Andrew to the webinar. Welcome, Dale. I'm assuming that, yes, Dale, do come on in, do press your webcam. We'd like to see you.
Yes, there we go.
There you go. Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to bow out and leave the platform to you.
Fine, thank you. So indeed, the report is very challenging in many ways. Asked to speak as an economist and talk about how maybe the natural scientists that make up the IRP can communicate with economists. I'm then going to make some comments about the paradigm that seems to be used, that seems to be behind the report, and compare it to the OECD green growth paradigm, which you probably know is very similar to what UNEP's green economy has produced. And finally, I'm going to end up with a concrete example of the external costs borne by a producing country in exporting minerals and metals, and whether and how the IRP report can address this in terms of policy recommendation. So to start with my first point about language and terminology, I'm going to read a couple of things that come from the recent WTO, the World Trade Organization, statistical report to show you the difference in approach that trade economists use. So the value of global trade in goods and services stood at $23.4 trillion in 2014. Some 20% of this is trade in commercial services, such as travel, professional services, financial, etc. And these are gross trade flows rather than value-added. Should they be expressed in value-added terms, they strongly underestimate the contribution of services to international trade. Continuing on, there was the so-called Great Trade Collapse in 2009, when there was a 12% drop in growth. Marina didn't make, I think, reference in the slides, but there was some discussion of that in the report. But international trade has not returned to the trend growth line previously known. In fact, in 2013 it was 17% below, and in 2014, 19% below. Carrying on to something that everybody wants to become part of, it's the name of the game in town, our global value chain, the internationalization of production, that is organization of global production networks, shows that nearly 1/2 of trade in goods and services was in global value chains. Now, what's my point? It's that economists use a common denominator, a numeraire, such as the US dollar or euro, to try and compare different phenomena. This is the accepted methodology. So my question is, can scientists speaking in measures of weight, such as tons, communicate with economists? Can we measure and therefore analyze new paradigms of trade, such as the global value chains, using tons? And this is important because, as all analysis of trade points out today, the nature of trading has been changing, particularly with the emergence of the global value chains and the growing participation of developing countries in these. So it's no longer just a matter of the South exporting commodities to the North. Secondly, moving on to the whole question of the paradigm and how, to what extent it's compared with, can be compared to green growth. The report is an exploration of the role, I'm quoting now from the introduction, of international trade in increasing resource efficiency, reducing environmental impact, and promoting equitable and inclusive growth. The report examines upstream resource requirements. We just heard Marina mention this, in terms of materials, energy, land, and water, used in the country of origin for producing the goods, but left behind as waste and emissions. So it focuses more on environmental efficiency than on economic efficiency, and explains how trade can be resource efficient to be obtained from countries where the production requires fewer resources. So here, now, if I go to my slides, I want to show, this is a complicated schema, but to show that indeed green growth considers energy and raw materials inputs, and also, on the other end, pollutants and waste. This is important then because the idea is to try and come up with indicators for each of these. For the environmental and resource productivity, in other words, are we doing more with less, as green growth paradigm would suggest we should be doing? We're looking at measures of carbon and energy productivity, resource productivity, but concrete measures, in other words, indicators for each of these, including multi-factor productivity, and now a considerable emphasis on environmentally adjusted multi-factor productivity. On the other side, on another aspect of the green growth, we have the environmental dimension of the quality of life and looking at environmental health and risks. This, I think, has not been covered in the report. So the question then really is to what extent is there overlap between UNEP's green economy or OECD's green growth paradigms? And I think that there is a lot of potential of discussion here. As I say, the OECD is trying to put indicators onto these, including what is mentioned. I've focused in my comments on metals and minerals, looking at disposal, release of toxic substances, and a general contamination and overexploitation of soil and water reserves near the mines. This is then looked at in the report in terms of these various approaches. We see that they've tried to look at raw material equivalence method, the life cycle approach. I think we'll hear more about that in the next presentation. But it is concluded in the report that these different calculation methods present widely diverging results and do not allow firm conclusions to be drawn. So it's a little bit, obviously, frustrating at this point in the research to know whether indeed the environmental impacts, for example, of metals trade that I've looked at in more detail, is something that can be affirmed. Now, I think there's a very one of the most interesting concrete examples in the report is a small box on platinum, the case study, where it's explained that there are three main streams of waste related to platinum mines: waste rock, ore processing tailings, and smelter slags. It's mentioned that data on waste rock are unavailable. Obviously, this is basically just what you're pushing aside to get down to the ore. But almost 96 to 98% of the ore becomes tailings. Now, this is very, very important, as we'll see in my concrete example in a minute, because they're disposed of in tailing ponds that also store smelter slags. This is directly from the platinum case study. So we understand what is being driven at, which is our environmental impacts that because of technology developments, outsourcing, just-in-time logistics, other improvements in transport have led to a decoupling of emissions associated with consumption in the developed countries. But is this just basically leakage back to the producing countries? Are we, on a net basis, really not any further along on a global basis as between production and consumption? An important question with important policy implications, difficult to discern, but as I understand it from the report, it's not able really to answer this question in the area of metals and ores. Finally, to come to the third point, the reality of environmental impacts, I wanted to show a short video. It wasn't possible technically, but I do have a series of photos. For those of you who may have followed, in southeast Brazil, in the state of Minas Gerais, there was a tailings dam that ruptured, that burst on the 5th of November. One of these, here's the dam down here below the tailings pond, and the mines upstream. The dam broke. Here's a segment from a video, and the result was some 55 million cubic meters. That's equivalent of 25,000 Olympic swimming pools were released. A mixture of sand, clay, and mining tailings, which are the leftover residues of beneficiation from the mines. Not dissimilar, all these are obviously open-air mines, not dissimilar to what was described in the study on platinum. The result was that Bento Rodriguez here in the lower corner was literally wiped off the face of the Earth, the face of the map, and these 55 million cubic meters of sludge roared down the Rio Doce, and here's some of the destruction in the path. Cars astride buildings, 12 people dead and many others missing. Here's a photo that made its way around the world of a rescue worker being able to save a dog. But of course, the human tragedy was there as well. Here's a comparison of the Rio Doce, which was a clear stream, also river, also important for entertainment and kayaking, and the way it is today with the mud. It is estimated 11,000 tons of fish died. San Marco, the owner and manager of the mine, or hiring fishermen to bury the fish. The Rio Doce comes down, turns right in the corner of at Governador Valadares, and heads then to the sea and the Atlantic. And this happened in something like 16, 17 days, so that the mud actually arrived at the Atlantic Ocean at that time. Here I throw a challenge back to Marina and the authors of the report. The report in the introduction says again and again that it's policy relevant, but I in fact really found no policy recommendations. And what kind of policy recommendations for Brazil concern the collapse of this Fundão Dam? It must be noted this is not an isolated case. In 2010, a reservoir burst in western Hungary with an alumina plant dumping red mud into the local environment and the slurry flowing into the Danube. The Mount Poly mine disaster in central British Columbia in 2014 resulted in a breach of copper and gold mine tailings into the environment. So if the analysis points to a heavier ecological footprint in mineral and ore producing countries, who are the producing ore that are producing these ores and minerals for export, what are the implications and policy recommendations that follow for the countries consuming the metals and ores? We heard in one of last slides that reducing consumption could be one answer. This is difficult and complicated. Developed countries have made some limited progress in recent years in changing consumer behavior. But is this all that the report can point to? Thank you.
Okay, so hello everybody. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to bring my halfpenny as a discussant in replacement of Derek Eaton, my colleague in the Global Footprint Network. I'm lost the view. I'm here again. Sorry for this disruption. Since I'm not the right type to compare the respective merits of different quantitative methods to make biophysical trade data speak, I'll confine my contribution as a discussant to explore the possible relevance of the analysis exposed in this IRP report from a user's perspective That is the perspective of someone attempting to help frame alternative policies that may focus more on the increasing biophysical trade interdependency and the impending global resource scarcity issues associated with crossing important planetary boundaries. It may be useful to identify in very general terms where international trade and its potential for improving the environmental performance of the global economy stand in relation to this concerned footprint or perspective. In this relation, international trade is indeed seen rather as a facilitator of the response to rising global demand. If you allow me to use a criminalist analogy, international trade may be less of a perpetrator of the rising global demands, one that is ultimately responsible for the increasing pressure on the global environment, than an accomplice in enabling such a rising global demand to be met by supply. Therefore, if I were bluntly asked which stylized actor is, in my view, the primary responsible
Sorry, we seem to be having some technical difficulties this morning with the webinar software. So what I would like to do is, unfortunately we lost Michel, and hopefully we'll get him back to finish his comments. So if possible, I'd like to ask Marina to go ahead and share her webcam and to respond to some of the comments from Dale.
Okay. I start with, can we collaborate with economists? Can we compare indicators? Does it make sense to link these two sort of bags of information? I think we should, and I think we can. So some of what was the efforts done in tons relate to flows in monetary terms, of course, and we have managed fairly well to look at consumption and production worldwide, both biophysically and economically. For trade, this is the first effort, and I agree it did not yet achieve what you want to see. Of course, you see the same phenomena like the crisis in 2009 and the not yet full recovery by now. You also see what you call global value chains, of course, because that's what I was showing as changes in the participation of low and medium income countries in world trade. That's exactly, I think, a phenomenon that derives from these global value chains. The major advantage or the privilege of physical accounting consists in the fact that we have a defined size or amount of resources that are annually extracted in countries and globally. This is something in economic terms you cannot really consistently reconstruct. And so you can refer trade to this amount of extraction and look where the global extraction moves. Yeah? So this is the strength, if you will, of biophysical accounting. And it is different to looking at environmental impacts. And I think your example showed very, I shouldn't say beautifully, very drastically what environmental impacts of mining, for example, are. And mining in the world happens, 70% or 80% of mining in the world happens to supply trade with resources desired somewhere else. So mining, metal mining is really the partner of trade, if you will, and all environmental impacts happening in metal mining have to do with trade, obviously. The second issue you raised is there just, if we save, for example, carbon emissions in high-income countries, is that a real saving, or is that just a leakage to other countries? There is research there. In the meantime, since this report was done, it's published now, but it was done a year ago, it is even more clear and decisive. So we can say when we include the upstream requirements of carbon emissions in trade, we find that the savings of trade in high-income Western countries are much less than if we just look at their direct emissions, but they still exist. So they are not, they still exist, they're there. But the data are still a bit divergent, but this fact is given. So finally, you say, and I think you are right, the policy recommendation of reducing consumption is too weak. This is not exactly what I said. I think the one issue, namely really saving in fossil fuel consumption, which is part and parcel of what we're trying to do now, it makes a lot of difference in world trade, much more than you would think so in money terms, and would also reduce a lot of side effects of trade, like spills in oceans, etc., that are not recorded in that report. And the other important issue is that our measure of domestic material consumption is really a measure of what resources imported in the past or extracted in the past are deposited in the infrastructures and also in the waste bins of countries. So if we go for a policy of more circularity, exactly those high-income Western countries have a huge deposit in their middle, and we must find technologies to shift from virgin materials to secondary materials. This is something we will have to do. It replies to some of your issues. Your metal flows, of course, your leakage of the Brazilian mine is much more than these descriptive data, I must admit, also from my emotions.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Marina. That's excellent. Let me see if we have Michel back, and if he would like to continue his comments. I did see him for a moment, but see if we can ask him to join again by webcam. A few challenges here, my apologies. Maybe what we'll do while we wait for him to come back again is to turn, as Paul mentioned, we've been receiving some excellent questions through the audience. And so, Marina, let me ask you a few of these questions and see if you can respond. So some of them are very similar to the comments made by Dale. So let me just start with the first, and that is why focus only on physical aspects of trade? If we don't consider the options for correcting financial signals that affect trade decisions, then we're not really serious about changing anything. So this was a question from an audience member. And I'll open this up both to Marina and to Dale, but first Marina.
Yeah, well, I respond to this one, yeah? Not
Yeah.
correct. Yeah, but there are piles of reports on trade in financial terms and on changing rules of trade. And this was an effort of the IRP to look at trade from a different perspective. I don't claim that this is the sort of fulfills all you want to hear about it, but this has never been done. So this is the goal of this report. And of course, we very early on decided that this report is not going to go into major policy questions because it's difficult to answer these policy questions without looking at both sides simultaneously, at the financial and the physical side.
Excellent, thank you. Dale, did you have any comments on that point that you would like to share?
Thank you, Ben. I understand, as I said, conceptually that both inputs in terms of materials, waste, water, land, etc., are being measured together with the outputs. But I still have a bit of a problem conceptually in understanding the difference or how, to what extent there's overlap between these upstream material requirements, as you call them, and the pollutants, the waste, and the emissions report. You make it clear at one point, you use the term, these are proxies for the others, but then you don't explain, I didn't find an explanation of the extent to which there's overlap, to which they are good proxies. So I think we're back in the debate, an environmental debate for years and years and years. To what extent can we quantify these pollutants and waste in financial terms? Can we put a value on them so that then these costs can be internalized, as we say as economists? Can they be added to the cost of production, which may or may not be passed on then to the consumption? They're all difficult questions, I recognize. But for an economist, we have to come back to the value of the good, the service, or the waste and the emissions in order to then have this common numeraire in order to then move on to a policy stance. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
The basically material flow perspective that was the methodological basis for this report is not the best to follow up on single pollutants and on chemical effects or pollutive effects. It is better equipped to look at scarcities, and that's on the input side of processes and not so much at the output side. You need life cycle analysis to look at the output side. But what I can say is that the mass balance of all, so if I look at the producing countries, the upstream flows in producing countries, they are all transformed into wastes and emissions. So the total amount of waste of emissions I know, and if I know, which I do, how large is the share of energy input into this process, for example, into mining, then I know how much emissions into air have been generated, and I can even calculate them pretty precisely. And the rest is, well, waste rock, and depends on the type of mining that you do. So if you go more deeply into these upstream flows, you know what is the burden in those countries that produce the materials that others consume.
Excellent, thank you.
But of course, if you single it out, what is the, like with your, like in this very nice example, we would have liked to have more examples on particular metals, because metal is such a precarious case of resource extraction and trade. We didn't get these examples, but the one shows how many facets of burden are generated at the place of mining.
Thank you. So we have some other good questions that have been posed by the audience. Let me turn to the next one. Does this analysis consider the fact that materials and goods traded have different specific weight? Therefore, the space occupied by different materials traded is different, even though their weight might be the same.
Different specific weights means, for example, including water content, or I don't exactly know specific weights in what respect.
I think they might be referring to the difference between the bulk of an item and its weight, and whether that has any bearing on the analysis.
Well, what is accounted for is mass, yeah, and not volume. So that's very clear. And there are standard conventions what is to be accounted for. And there is, for example, with metals, there are ores are accounted for. So not the pure metals, but the ores, yeah, when they are traded. Even if some countries import only the metals, then this is recalculated as ores because you have to make it comparable. So there's a lot of conventions how to standardize the weight or the mass of these traded commodities.
And a related question, one of the audience members notes that a feature of production in products like raw metals involves the production of a lot of waste material, which we've been discussing, obviously. They give the example of gold, and they mention that its weight might not be as much as some, but takes they estimate 1,000 times as much waste material. Should this be accounted for in trade volumes in weight?
Doesn't really make sense because trade has several features. You also have transportation as one feature of trade, yeah, and so it makes sense to have those things included in direct trade that are actually transported. If you include all the waste rock, which is 1,000 times higher in the case of gold, then you would need vessels for transporting gold that you never use. So that's exactly in the upstream materials. That's exactly the idea of the upstream materials, not the whole waste rock, that's not included, but at least the waste that are the excavation material and things like this that are produced on site. They are included in the upstream materials.
Excellent. And so the next question we received was from James Grayson, and so he basically asks us to take a step back, and he says sustainable development has also been promoted as inevitable over recent decades, but our society only seems to study it and try pilot projects and not to make it happen at scale. He asks, is circular economy just a new way to undergo the same failures without even asking what keeps going wrong? So Marina, I'll let you address that first, and then I think I'll turn that over to Dale as well, because it's an interesting question posed by James.
It is an interesting question. It's not so easy. I understand his suspicion, and it may turn out that way, yeah? But this is not necessarily so, because circular economy localized or adjusted to regional circumstances is a very reasonable idea. And circular economy isn't per definition global. So, but still, the suspicion is well warranted.
Thank you. Dale, any thoughts from your side?
As I mentioned on the question of changing consumer behavior, there has been some admittedly small progress in OECD countries. I wouldn't at all like to say we're on the verge of a new era. I've been struck. This is as everyone knows, COP21 is taking place in Paris at the moment. Hopefully we're going to have an agreement. How extensive it is at the end of the week, I don't know. But what my point is that we have been barraged, literally, by, with no pun intended, with the kinds of experiments that are going on in France. And even though I'm also French, I can say, therefore, clearly that France is not a leader in environmental consciousness, say, as some of the Nordic countries might be, and so on. But the point is, there are a lot of experiments going on that have been reported on television. So progress is there. Yes, attempts have been feeble in the past. The waking up to the importance of circular economies is something that I think also where private firms and industries have been really leading. So it's also the individual's role, but it's also, of course, to what extent private firms and so on. I just make one, slightly cynical comment, perhaps, but to come back to this question of the dam burst in Minas Gerais in Brazil. It's serious because it's hit the Financial Times. There have been articles about to what extent the markets now are downgrading the quality of San Marco on one hand. So again, this is an example where, and BHP Billiton, who as an Anglo-Australian firm, while they're joint owners, they're 50% owners, they're not actually managers, and they are reconsidering their whole strategy of providing capital without management in a joint venture. And I thought that was very, very interesting because the reputation of and the future of their firm has been severely hit by this ecological catastrophe, not to speak of even the financial fines and so on that Brazil, well, I won't make a comment, may or may not impose to a sufficient degree, but the point here is that these are realities today that I say have moved us forward in considerations of environmental damage in the circular economy.
Can I come in for a moment?
Yes, please.
If we have to hope for the stock market to rescue our environment, I mean, it's helpful. I agree. It's helping with Volkswagen at the moment too, but this is rare exceptions, I would say. No, but for example, for half a year ago, I was in Japan discussing these trade results with some 20 companies, and we had a discussion on secondary materials and regulating the use of secondary materials as a political regulation measure. And I suggested this as one of the important interventions. And I thought there would be an outcry of protests. Yeah, there was Toyota and tire producers and, well, 20 different large companies. And I was completely surprised to hear them respond. That would be a very good idea because it would create a level playing ground for the companies, that among them, those who act environmentally responsible try to do that, but that there were cost considerations that they couldn't cope with. And so things like this would make a major difference in saving resources, not so also in saving waste and emissions, but also in saving resources. So this is one of the policy recommendations that I would not hesitate to make, and I wouldn't think it hits back, but it's certainly not so easy politically to do that.
Thank you. Let me turn now to another very interesting comment and question, and this is from Olusola Adio. He says, I'm trying not to think of the environmental and social-cultural costs of impacts of international trade on Niger Delta in Nigeria. I'm also trying not to focus on the land grab narratives and the consequences for a number of countries, from Mali to Ethiopia. But he says his conclusion is that international trade has not contributed meaningfully to resource efficiency in Africa, focusing on the title of today's discussion. And he says, to paraphrase, his quick question would be, will international trade ever contribute to resource efficiency in Africa, considering the current practices that we see there? So Marina, your thoughts?
I agree. I don't think it did. As far as I can tell from the numbers, it didn't. And I mean, in Africa we have a conundrum of countries where some are very resource rich and some are very poor, like Ethiopia that has no metal resources or oil or whatever. Yeah? And so the responses or the impacts of trade on Africa will be very mixed. But I'm very worried what these impacts are going to be, honestly. I don't think of them in a very positive, with positive expectations. Because in South Africa, they make an effort to cope with these large mining companies they have and generate more benefit for the rest of the population. But still, South Africa is, in terms of Gini index, top of the world, and this is not going to change quickly. So it is very worrisome what you see about Africa. You see the oil curse hitting in Sudan and in Nigeria. So I certainly don't think international trade is a big benefit for Africa. But if there was no trade, that's sort of the counter assumption. What would it then be? Yeah, would it then be much better? That's a difficult question that was asked in the UNEP, and I couldn't, and nobody really could properly answer. We don't have a sort of second scenario that disposes of international trade and has a look what happens then.
Right. Dale, any thoughts from your side as someone that's focused much of their career on trade issues?
Are you asking Dale? Yeah.
Yes.
Not much to add. Africa is always le parent pauvre, and particularly the enfant pauvre of international trade. All of the regional trade agreements that are mushrooming literally around the world, and now the mega ones exclude Africa. So there are still some preferential arrangements. They have not been particularly successful. Nairobi is the site of the WTO ministerial beginning next week, I believe, and there's apparently very, very little on the table in terms of development. So the whole perspectives of both regional trade agreements and any sort of action, concrete development-oriented action taking place at the WTO is rather meager. Now, in terms of the environmental side or the resource efficiency side, I think a lot of these issues that we've been discussing with Marina come back in even greater to a greater dimension, the whole question of environmental impact and so on. But what does one conclude? I would conclude, as Marina does, what happens if there's no trade? Then of course Africa is completely cut off from the international world, and autarky has never been a solution to development.
Okay. We have an interesting question from Arsha Branson. They ask, how will these findings be transferred into reality? For example, how would transferring fossil fuel intensive energy generation to renewable energy, thus decreasing trade in fossil fuels, be transferred into reality? And goes on to say, although this makes sense conceptually, how would local pull factors, i.e. jobs and skills, transfer out of mining national lobbyists, local economic benefits, be incorporated into decisions or to be addressed?
A lot asked at once. So the issue of how far we rely upon fossil fuels as 50% of world trade and as the fuel for our energy needs is really bargained in Paris at the moment. And well, I can only hope that we do turn to a less materially intensive source of energy, and that would be solar and wind and yeah, to a certain degree biomass. This I can't include into my answer. But what we find, I mean, for example, the trade with Asia that has been increasing so much. It has been increasing because in Asia the wages were so low. And so you could buy 10 t-shirts in Vienna at least for the price of 2 because of low wages, and that's changing. So these extreme asymmetries of trade that have led to distortions, if you will, I think they are, at least in terms of the Asian partners, structurally changing. Maybe I'm too optimistic. But that's what I tend to see. I didn't show you the numbers for low-paid trade and low-paid labor embodied in trade and health detriments out of labor in trade. And there you see that the Asian countries export very high amounts of low-paid and health risky labor, and the recipients are Europe and the United States. But if you look at it in this time series, this disparity is slightly decreasing. So this is no straight answer to your very complex question, but it's just from remarks to what comes to my mind when I hear your several questions.
Thanks. Anything from your side, Dale? Or?
I'd like to emphasize the demand side of the equation. We've done a lot of work just before I left, and it's ongoing on the role of environmental policy in promoting trade. And I think the whole question of stringency in environmental regulations has been too often forgotten, to some extent even by the environmental side, but certainly by the trade side. In other words, the whole paradigm of trade liberalization is that there are somehow obstacles to trade on the supply side, and these need to be removed, whether this means reducing tariffs or non-tariff barriers. But if one also looks at the demand side, we've done a lot of empirical work showing that there's a direct correlation between the strictness of or the stringency of environmental regulations and trade, and our economics colleagues have looked at this in terms of also growth. So the point here in response to the question is that if we really have a COP21 agreement leading towards a global climate regime, even if it's based on a bottom-up approach where there are individual engagements, commitments from members, have been estimates by the World Resources Institute that this could double the demand for renewable energy. Renewable energy, of course, has become big business and good business as well today. But the point is, if we have some sort of commitment to stronger or more stringent environmental regulations, we have shown in empirical work that this leads both to growth but also to more trade in these products. So I think we should all keep in mind that there are also ways to address the demand side of the equation and not just supply side as we do in trade policy.
Thanks. We have a few more questions. We have about 10 minutes left, so let me just turn to those. We have a question from Hualing Bu, who indicates that as a related issue to our topic today, trade environment literature suggests that a way to frame the research is through the main three effects that we see in terms of trade. That refers to the scale, income, and structure effect. He cites Cropland and Taylor. And really asks the question whether this framework also works for the topic today when considering the question around trade and resource efficiency. And so it's really more of a theoretical question, Marina.
You say scale, income, and structure effect. That's what
yeah, so
he suggests as analytical dimensions.
Mm.
No?
Exactly.
So,
yeah. And so I think they refer to the fact that trade often increases the scale of economic activity. It can increase income, which leads to more consumption, and trade can also lead to changes in the structure of the economy. I think that's the.
Yeah, but there are a number of theories about the impact of resource trade on countries who export resources, and you may be acquainted with the resource curse, so-called resource curse theory, which is not really reconfirmed by our data, but it plays a role in several instances. And the resource curse means that countries rely on trading natural resources without seriously developing their structure and their mass incomes, but with increasing the income of a local or regional elite that then buys itself into all sorts of economic activities in the rest of the world. And this is something that does happen, particularly in oil exporting countries. And there was interesting analysis for Brazil, for example, what local or regional authorities do with the revenues they have from trading metals, and whether they put them just into their current budgets or whether they use them as investments for infrastructure, for future education, for things like this, and that makes a huge difference. And in the case of Brazil, some regions did it this way and some regions did it the other way. So it is very difficult you cannot be sure that trade in resources, which is, as I said, 80% of world trade in terms of mass, not in terms of value, but in terms of mass, whether it really helps countries to develop their mass income and their structures, their economic and infrastructures, depends. I must say it depends. In some cases it happens, and in other cases it's obviously not happening.
Excellent. Let me turn to a follow-up question, because time is short. This is a question from Carlos Cerruti, and he says, aside from resource efficiency, the current model of international trade seems to encourage a linear, so extract, produce, distribute, consume, dispose economy. Will a shift to a more circular economy imply a redefinition of global market flows? I think that's certainly a very interesting question. Marina, let me turn first to you, and then to Dale.
Yeah, this question is very welcome to me because I'm trying to draw the attention upon the big stores and stocks of resources countries, particularly high consumption countries that have imported all that stuff in the past, on the huge stocks they have, and that they need to use them in a circular economy. There can be in the future even a new type of international inequality, that those countries who had imported a lot of resources and do have them in their stocks all of a sudden become resource-rich countries, while other countries who were delivering metals, and in particular metals, metals to them across decades, they depleted their resources and they are resource poor countries. So paradoxically, the circular economy is a very important opportunity, particularly for high-income Western countries.
Interesting. Dale, your thoughts?
Well, recycling, and come back to the metals and sector, is not new. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is now, but of course, much
between 1% and 40.
No, but it's
40 for iron and
less than
1 for most other metals.
The point is that, as is pointed out in your report, the energy input for recycling steel is much, much less. So it's not just a matter of recycling, using less iron ore and pellets and beneficiated materials to go into it. But so this is nothing new, and it's because it's cost effective. It's cost effective in part because of this lower energy input. Here I am, the trade economist, defending the environmental side, which is fine. But my problem with the circular economy is not that it's wrong, is that it's looking. If you think back to my diagram, the OECD paradigm of green growth, it addresses the inputs. Yes, we're going to use inputs that are then recycled, that become circular. But what about the pollutants and the waste? I don't think it addresses in the same way. Yeah, there'll be less of them because we're using less, but the point is really trying to find either uses for or stricter environmental policy to address effluents, emissions, waste, contamination, and so on. I haven't seen a good theoretical analysis of how that fits into the circular economy.
True, it doesn't. I mean, it's not.
It
this
doesn't.
is another issue. Yeah, and I completely agree that you are right. Yeah, this is another issue that has to be addressed on top of circularity questions. But circularity issues would resolve at least part of this, and that you admitted. I mean, according to new publications, the global circularity and also the European circularity is about 40% if you are very optimistic. If you say that all biogenic resources are by definition circular because they are sort of re-enter the biosphere and are transformed there, and only the non-biogenic resources have to be recycled or reused or whatever in order to be circular. 40% is, yeah, out of these 40%, most is biogenic resources. So we do not, and everybody says recycling is cost effective. The way we design our products, it is not. And we had this long discussion in Japan with all these producers, and they said it is a design question, and as soon as you would have really a strict regulation for using secondary materials as share of your input, only then would there be a strong influence on how to design products and how to deal with wastes in order to make recycling cost effective. At the moment it is not, because it's so many metals are such a minute share in products that it is a huge effort to recover them. It just doesn't happen. And it won't happen unless we design our products differently. So unfortunately, recycling isn't cost effective. It's not even cost effective for so simple things like paper. Yeah? And there's a lot of sort of fogging around about how much of our carefully collected household paper is really in recycling and how much of it is just burned. So let's not be optimistic about the current state of recycling. I think it is very bad.
Interesting. Well, let me. We're nearly out of time, Marina and Dale. But so let me just ask you to respond to a general question, and that's the title of this webinar. And just for your last thoughts, before we close up. And the question, of course, is can international trade increase resource efficiency? And obviously a very challenging question. But let me first start with Dale, and then to allow Marina her final thoughts before we close the webinar. Dale.
Yes, it can. I think like most of those questions that we've been trying to address in the trade and environment debate, I've been involved for over 20 years. The question is really that there have to be complementary policies, flanking policies in place. I think this is, we didn't get very far with the example in Brazil. I'd just like to mention again that it was in Rio, after all, that Principle 10, the Rio Principles, which addresses the responsibility to share environmental information, was adopted, and Vale has its headquarters in Rio. There were allegations that no information was given to concerned citizens for several days, if not over a week. So there are things that can be done in terms of complementary policies, but of course the basic premise that trade leads to resource efficiency, I think is there. It's what else is there in addition as complementary policy that's important. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. So Marina, you have the final word in today's webinar.
Okay, so simple. I keep it simple. So I think increasing trade will not increase resource efficiency, just like that. I guess there we agree there. Whether current trade contributes to resource efficiency, there are mixed answers. As I showed, it contributes to using fresh water, for example. It does. That's more or less proven. It's much less proven and even very questionable for other things. In terms of food and in terms of cropland, we also can assume there is a contribution to resource efficiency. Tomatoes in glass houses in Holland consume about 5 times as much energy and whatnot than open-grown tomatoes in the south of Spain. Okay, so there are some instances like this, but as a general saying, I would not agree that trade as such contributes to resource efficiency unless other measures are taken. And in trade, for the costs of trade, and there economics plays a major role, for the cost of trade, of course, labor cost is quite an important issue. And labor cost in traded products is at least 50% of the value of what is traded. So unless we get a more even distribution of labor costs around the world, trade will have a very uneven impact on resource efficiency. So that's my preliminary answers. I would have it was this idea of the IRP that pursues the question of resource efficiency as a solution to environmental scarcity and environmental problems, to apply this paradigm also to trade. And well, as you said at the beginning, the answer is very mixed.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. Let me just use this opportunity to thank Marina, both you and Dale, for all of your extremely interesting comments. The discussion, I think, was very rich. It was a very exciting debate that we had today. I'd also like to just apologize for some of the technical difficulties we had, and then thank Paul Eakins and Michelle Gressot in absentia for their participation as well, their earlier participation. I'd like to congratulate the International Resource Panel and you, Marina, on a really very interesting study that no doubt will stimulate some further dialogue. We were thrilled to be able to offer this as a webinar to try to increase the outreach and discussion around the study, which is very interesting. Unfortunately, we had many questions that we weren't able to address today from speakers, I would just encourage from participants, I would just encourage those participants to visit the GGKP web platform. We have a number of different studies related to trade, and they'll find further information related to these topics. And also to try to check back, we do organize these webinars. Occasionally, we organized, as I mentioned, 6 this year. We'll organize a similar number next year, and I would encourage you to continue to participate. So with that, I will say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Marina and Dale, and thank you to all the other participants on today's webinar. Thank you.
And thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.